A gloomy November night in 1942. Two massive Halifax bombers take off from RAF Skitton Base in northern Scotland. Behind each of them, a Horsa glider disappears into the darkness. Inside are a total of 34 young British soldiers, and none of them know that this night will be their last. This is no ordinary military operation. This is a mission that could change the course of history. The target? A single factory hidden among Norway's most treacherous mountains, fueling Nazi Germany's atomic bomb dreams. If they fail, Hitler could become the owner of the world's first nuclear weapon. If this story has already sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this is the story of one of the most tragic and least known operations of World War II. Now let's look at how it all began. By 1942, World War II was raging at full intensity. But beyond the battlefields, an even more dangerous race was underway in the laboratories. Nazi Germany's scientists were on the verge of creating history's most destructive weapon, the atomic bomb. So what did they need to build this weapon? The answer seemed surprisingly simple: heavy water. Heavy water, unlike regular water, is a special liquid containing deuterium instead of hydrogen atoms. This substance was critical for controlling nuclear reactions. The Germans needed large quantities of heavy water to produce an atomic bomb, and there was only one place in the world capable of producing this material on an industrial scale: the Vemork hydroelectric plant in Norway's Telemark region. Built in 1934, Vemork was the world's first commercial heavy water production facility. It could produce 1.2 tons of heavy water per year. When Nazi Germany occupied Norway in 1940, this facility came directly under German control. British intelligence was aware of this situation, and they knew one fact very clearly: if the Germans obtained enough heavy water, they could possess a weapon capable of changing the fate of the war, the atomic bomb. This was unacceptable. Vemork had to be destroyed. But there was a major problem. Vemork was one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. The facility was built into the side of a deep valley. On one side were 600-meter vertical cliffs, on the other, frozen rivers and glacial plateaus. The Hardangervidda Plateau had one of Europe's harshest climates. In winter, temperatures could drop to -30 degrees. Legend has it that this plateau was so cold that even the flames of a fire could freeze. Conventional bombing was impossible. The facility was buried inside the mountain, beneath thick concrete walls. Moreover, civilians lived in the nearby town of Rjukan. A single misguided bomb could kill hundreds of innocent people. Extreme caution was required. Approaching by sea? Impossible. Norway's mountainous coastline and German patrol boats wouldn't allow it. Parachute drop? The region's dangerous terrain and unpredictable weather conditions made this too risky. The British War Cabinet evaluated all options. Finally, they made a bold decision: a glider operation. Gliders were silent aircraft without engines. They would be towed by a towing aircraft to a point close to the target, then released to glide in silently. This was an ideal method for landing near the target quietly under cover of night, evading enemy radar. The plan was this: 2 Horsa gliders carrying specially trained Royal Engineers would fly to Norway. They would land near the frozen Lake Mosvatn on the Hardangervidda Plateau. There, they would be met by Norwegian agents who had been parachuted into the area earlier. Then, together, they would march to Vemork, blow up the facility, and escape to the Swedish border. The code name for this operation? Operation Freshman. Before Freshman, a preparatory operation was needed. The British Special Operations Executive, known as SOE, had sent 4 Norwegian agents to Telemark. The code name for this operation was Grouse, meaning a type of game bird in English. The Grouse team consisted of 4 men: Team leader 24-year-old Lieutenant Jens Anton Poulsen, 29-year-old Sergeant Arne Kjellstrup, 25-year-old Lieutenant Knut Hogland, and 23-year-old Sergeant Klaus Hellberg. All four came from this region of Norway and knew the terrain like the back of their hands. On October 18, 1942, they were dropped by parachute from a Halifax bomber onto the Hardangervidda. However, due to poor weather conditions, the pilot dropped them 100 kilometers from the target. The Norwegians skied for days through freezing cold and knee-deep snow, carrying their heavy equipment to reach the landing zone. Their task was simple but critical: identify the landing area for the gliders, light signal fires, and operate the Rebecca-Eureka radar system. This system would help the towing aircraft find the exact location. Then they would meet the British engineers and guide them to Vemork. The Grouse team completed their mission successfully. They found a suitable landing area near the Moswatten Dam. They established radio contact with London. Everything was ready. They were just waiting for the British. RAF Skitten Base was a desolate place in the northeastern tip of Scotland, where winds and rain never ceased. On the evening of November 19, 1942, weather reports were concerning. Heavy cloud cover and deteriorating conditions were expected over Norway. But the operation was not postponed. Time was critical. Every passing day, the Germans were producing more heavy water. If this story excites you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. At 11 p.m., the first Halifax glider combination took off. Half an hour later, the second followed. Behind each Halifax, a Horsa glider was attached by a thick steel cable. Each glider carried 17 people, 2 pilots and 15 Royal Engineers. In total, 34 soldiers were flying toward what was perhaps one of the most dangerous missions of World War II. Who were these soldiers? All were volunteers. Before being selected for the mission, they didn't even know what it was. All they knew was that it was an extremely dangerous and classified mission, and yet they had accepted without hesitation. Among them was 24-year-old Lieutenant Alexander Charles Allen, a young man from Birmingham, a graduate of King Edward VI School, working as a mechanical engineer at Dunlop. He was a passionate supporter of the Aston Villa football team. His officers described him as a born leader. Among them was 18-year-old Private Gerald, the youngest soldier of the operation. He had just celebrated his birthday a few days earlier. His officers described him as always ready for action, a soldier mature beyond his years. Among them was 25-year-old driver Ernest Pendlebury, from Yorkshire, son of a textile worker, graduate of Bradford Technical College. He had married in 1940. His wife Marjorie was waiting for his return. These young men had left without saying goodbye to their families. Due to security requirements, they couldn't say where they were going. They simply said it was a special mission. Their families hoped they would return someday. As the aircraft flew over the North Sea, the soldiers inside were probably thinking about the details of the mission. They would land the gliders silently on a snow-covered plateau. They would meet up with the Norwegian agents. They would march to the facility, plant explosives, and escape. The plan seemed simple, but in war, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that night, the enemy wasn't just the Germans. The enemy was nature itself. As the aircraft approached the Norwegian coast, weather conditions deteriorated dramatically. Dense cloud cover had reduced visibility to zero. The steel tow cables began to ice over. This extra weight seriously reduced the aircraft's maneuverability. The first combination, Halifax A and Glider A, reached the Hardangervidda. The pilots began searching for the Grouse team's signal fires, but they couldn't see anything through the thick cloud cover. The Rebecca-Eureka radar system wasn't working either. A technical failure prevented the aircraft from connecting with the ground team. The pilots descended and climbed repeatedly. They tried to find the landing zone, but it was futile. Their fuel was running low. Finally, they decided to turn back. Is this story exciting to you? Feel free to share in the comments. But disaster struck on the return journey. The tow cable, weighed down by ice, snapped. Glider A began falling out of control. The pilots desperately tried to regain control of the glider, but in the darkness, inside the clouds, they couldn't even see where they were landing. The glider crashed into a steep slope in the Fylgjesdalen Valley. The moment of impact was horrific. The glider's wooden frame shattered to pieces. Of the 17 people inside, 8 died instantly. The others were seriously injured. Only 5 were relatively unharmed. Meanwhile, the fate of the second combination, Halifax B and Glider B, would be even more tragic. The pilots probably flew low to search for the first glider. The cost of this decision was heavy. Halifax B crashed into Haystad Mountain. All 7 crew members died instantly. Glider B broke free from the tow cable at the last moment, but lost control. It crashed into nearby Benkja Mountain. Both pilots died in the crash. One of the soldiers succumbed to his injuries shortly after. 14 survivors remained. They were wounded, in shock, but alive. It was an extremely dramatic situation. The grouse team waiting on the Hardangervidda had heard the sound of aircraft in the sky. They had lit their signal fires, but no one came. They didn't yet know that the gliders had crashed. And the worst part? This night wasn't over yet. What awaited the surviving British soldiers was far more terrible than the crash. This is where part 1 ends. If you enjoyed this first part, please like and subscribe. I will tell you in detail in part 2 what happened to these young soldiers, the nightmare they experienced when they fell into the hands of the Gestapo, and the courage they showed in their final moments. But I can tell you this, the next part will open one of the darkest pages of World War II, and the story of these young men will shake you to your core. Now let's continue without slowing down. Welcome back to part 2, dear viewers. We continue our story from where we left off. As the first light of the morning of November 20th, 1942 rose on the southwestern coast of Norway, the wreckage of 2 shattered gliders lay at 2 different locations. Scattered metal fragments, broken wood, bloodstains, and footprints trailing across the frozen ground. These were the first signs of Operation Freshman's tragic end. But for the survivors, the real nightmare had not yet begun, because what awaited these men was far more terrible than the glider crash. Hitler's most ruthless order was waiting for them. In the Fylgjesdalen Valley, the wreckage of Glider A was scattered across the landscape. Of the 17 people on board, 8 had died in the crash. Of the remaining 9, 4 were seriously wounded, while 5 were relatively unharmed. The survivors were in shock. When they looked around, they saw the lifeless bodies of their comrades. In the freezing cold, they tried to pull their wounded friends from the wreckage. But where were they? What should they do? They stayed true to their training. First, they began burning the classified documents and maps they carried. This information must not fall into German hands. The Germans must never learn that their target was Vemork. They didn't know how many documents they managed to throw into the fire, but they did the best they could. They needed urgent medical help for their wounded comrades. Their options were limited. Either they would freeze to death in the mountains, or they would seek help. There had to be a farmhouse nearby. 2 soldiers set off into the darkness to find help. After hours of walking, they reached the home of a Norwegian farmer. When they knocked on the door, it was the early hours of the morning. The farmer was surprised to see these foreign soldiers standing at his door. The British tried to explain the situation with broken Scandinavian words and hand gestures. They had wounded comrades. They needed urgent medical help. The Norwegian farmer knew what it meant to help these soldiers in his Nazi-occupied country, but his sense of humanity prevailed. A local doctor was called. This Norwegian physician named Dr. Gruben went to the crash site and examined the wounded. Later, when testifying at war crimes trials, he would say, "I was certain that 8 of the wounded would definitely recover. Only 1 was in uncertain condition." However, these wounded men would never get the chance to recover. The news spread quickly. There had been a crash, there were foreign soldiers, and inevitably this news reached German ears. On the morning of November 20th, the Gestapo headquarters in Stavanger went on alert. German security forces and the local Wehrmacht unit were dispatched to the scene. Within hours, all survivors had been captured. The Norwegian farmers couldn't hide them. The Germans were searching everywhere. The 9 captured British soldiers were first held at a local farmhouse, then they were transferred to Stavanger. While 4 seriously wounded were held in a building under Gestapo control, the 5 relatively unharmed soldiers were sent to the Lagersveien Gestapo prison in Stavanger. And this is exactly when Hitler's most darkest order came into play. On October 18, 1942, just 1 month before Operation Freshman, Adolf Hitler had issued a secret order to all German forces. This order was officially known as the Commando Order, or in German, Kommando Befehl. This order trampled on all the rules of the laws of war. The order stated, "From now on, all enemy soldiers captured in sabotage missions, whether in uniform or not, whether armed or not, whether captured in battle or while fleeing, shall be executed immediately and without interrogation. No exceptions shall be made." Quite ruthless, isn't it? This order was a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. Prisoners of war had certain rights under international law. They could not be executed. They were to be treated with dignity. However, Hitler was so afraid of commando operations that he chose to completely ignore these rules. The Commando Order had been transmitted directly from Berlin to the German command in Norway. General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, commander of German forces in Norway, had distributed this order to all subordinate units. And now the first victims of this order were the British soldiers captured at Fylkesdalen. In Stavanger, at the Gestapo headquarters, 4 seriously wounded British soldiers lay in captivity. They were Corporal James Cairncross, Lance Corporal Trevor Masters, Private William Smith, and driver Eric Farrell. These 4 young men had sustained serious injuries in the crash: broken bones, internal bleeding, head trauma. Under normal circumstances, they should have received treatment in a hospital. As prisoners of war, they had the right to medical care. But what awaited them was not treatment. The Gestapo began interrogating these 4 men. They wanted to know where they came from, what their mission was, what their target was. The soldiers, as they had been trained, gave only their name, rank, and service number. They said nothing else. This silence infuriated the Gestapo, and the torture began. Testimonies that emerged during war crimes trials revealed the horror of those days. The Stavanger Gestapo chief and other officials mercilessly interrogated these 4 wounded men. On November 23rd or 24th, just a few days after their capture, these 4 soldiers were killed. But the manner of their deaths revealed the darkest face of war. According to statements given at the War Crimes Tribunal, SS Dr. Werner Fritz Seeling injected high doses of morphine into these 4 soldiers. This was to sedate and calm them, but this was not enough. According to the testimony of Gestapo driver Erich Hoffmann, one soldier's throat was crushed by repeatedly pressing on his larynx. Another was strangled with rope. Another was strangled with a leather strap, and the 4th was taken to the basement of the Gestapo headquarters and shot in the back of the head. Dr. Seeling himself had actively participated in these deaths. Later in court, he claimed he had given the wounded morphine to relieve their pain. However, witnesses revealed that he had done much more. Sealing had killed some soldiers by injecting air into their veins. This method caused heart attacks by creating air bubbles in the blood. The bodies of the 4 soldiers were weighted down with stones and thrown into the sea off Stavanger. The Gestapo was trying to destroy the evidence. The families of these 4 young men would never know where their sons, husbands, or brothers were. In 1985, a special memorial was erected at Stavanger Eigenes Cemetery in memory of these 4 soldiers, a place of remembrance for 4 heroes whose graves are unknown. Their bodies were never found. Unfortunately, these are the cruel realities of war. A different fate awaited the other 5 survivors from Glider A. They were relatively less injured, and the Gestapo hoped to extract more information from them. On November 29th, these 5 soldiers were transferred from Stavanger to Grini concentration camp near Oslo. Grini was the largest concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Norway. Thousands of Norwegian resistance members were held there. The British soldiers were interrogated here for weeks. They were forced to give statements repeatedly, both at Grini and at the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo. The Gestapo particularly wanted to learn one thing: what was the target? Why had they come to Norway? The soldiers, as they had been trained, gave only their name, rank, and service number. They said nothing else. This silence infuriated the Gestapo, and the torture began. Testimonies that emerged during war crimes trials revealed the horror of those days. The 5 soldiers were held at Grini for approximately 2 months. Cold, inadequate food, constant interrogations. But at least they were alive. Perhaps they could survive until the end of the war. Perhaps they could return home someday. This hope ended on January 19, 1943. That day, the 5 British soldiers were taken from Grini. They were not told where they were going. They were loaded onto a truck and taken north of Oslo to Trondheim Forest. Trondheim Forest was a place where hundreds of Norwegian resistance fighters were executed during the Nazi occupation. Among the dark pine trees, nameless graves lay hidden. In the twilight of the morning, the 5 British soldiers were lined up before a firing squad. They were shot by the SS Special Unit Sonderkommando. Their bodies were buried in an unmarked pit in the forest. Their families were given no notification. An interesting coincidence. That day, among the victims of the same firing squad was a British sailor named Able Seaman Robert Evans. Evans was the sole survivor of another failed operation, Operation Tidal, which had attempted to sink the German battleship Tirpitz. He too had become a victim of the Commando Order. 6 men were buried in the same pit. 6 families would not know where their sons were for years. Now let's return to the story of the second glider, because this story is perhaps even more heartbreaking. Glider B had crashed into Benkia Mountain. 2 pilots and 1 soldier had died in the crash. 14 survivors remained. They were wounded, but on their feet. These 14 soldiers found themselves in southwestern Norway, near Egersund. Around them were only mountains, darkness, and freezing cold. Despite their injuries, they needed to make a plan. First, they tried to destroy the classified documents they carried. They threw maps, orders, and codebooks into the fire. At least, they thought they did. But in the darkness, in their haste, they had missed one map. This map clearly showed that their target was Vemork. 2 soldiers went to the nearest farmhouse to seek help. After midnight, they knocked on the door of Lensmann Hovland. A lensmann was a type of local official or mayor in Norway. Hovland wanted to help the wounded soldiers, but to call for help, he had to notify the authorities. And so, the Germans learned the location of the second glider as well. On the morning of November 20th, between 10 and 11 o'clock, all 14 British soldiers were captured by German soldiers. Wehrmacht units, the regular German army, took custody of these soldiers. They took them to the nearby Slettebe German military camp. An interesting situation arose here. The Wehrmacht commanders were unsure how to treat these soldiers. They were wearing proper British uniforms. They had weapons, but had surrendered. According to international laws of war, they should have been held as prisoners of war. But the Gestapo thought differently. 2 Gestapo agents from Stavanger, members of the SD or security service, came to Slettebe. They interrogated and photographed the British soldiers. They paid particular attention to the equipment found on them, especially the sabotage materials. And they found that missed map. The map explained everything. The target was Vemork. These soldiers had come to sabotage the German atomic bomb program. Wehrmacht Commander Colonel Probst had to make a decision. Would the soldiers be considered prisoners of war or saboteurs? Would he comply with the Geneva Convention or Hitler's Commando Order? He was under pressure. The Gestapo wanted the soldiers executed immediately. The Wehrmacht was inclined to follow international law, but in the end, Hitler's order prevailed. November 20th, 1942, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The 14 British soldiers were taken outside Slettebe camp. On the path known as the Burma Road, they were lined up approximately 80 meters apart. Each was held by 2 German soldiers. And then, one by one, they were led before the firing squad. According to testimonies, each soldier heard his comrade in front of him being executed. The gunshots, then silence, then footsteps, the next soldier being led away, and gunshots again. 14 young men took their last breaths listening to each other die. Their bodies were stripped of their uniforms and buried that night in an unmarked pit in the sand dunes at Brusand. The Germans planned to keep this a secret. But a Norwegian farmer was watching the burial from a distance. He memorized the location. He never told anyone until the war ended, but he never forgot. And in 1945, he would show this place to Allied forces. In the midst of these tragic events, the attitude of the Norwegian people is particularly noteworthy. In a country under Nazi occupation, helping meant death, but they helped anyway. The first to reach the crash sites were Norwegian farmers. They helped the wounded. They gave them warm drinks and blankets. They called for doctors. They collected and hid the remaining documents that the British soldiers had burned. When the Germans came, the Norwegians couldn't hide the soldiers. They didn't have the power, but they did what they could. And more importantly, they never forgot the dead. The farmer who saw where the 14 soldiers executed at Slettebe were buried kept this secret for years. He waited until the Germans left. Then he notified the Allies. The graves of the 5 soldiers executed in Trandum Forest were also found and marked by Norwegians. The graves of the crash victims at Filgisdalen were secretly tended by local people. The Germans wanted these soldiers to remain nameless and forgotten. The Norwegians wouldn't allow it. Throughout the war, Norwegian civilians visited these unmarked graves. They left flowers. They lit candles. Without being seen by the Germans, they kept the memory of these foreign soldiers alive. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. This was a small but meaningful act of resistance, remembering what the Nazis wanted forgotten, giving names to the nameless dead, preserving their honor. The map seized by the Gestapo created a major security breach. They now knew the target was Vemork. The Germans acted immediately. Security measures at Vemork were dramatically increased. Additional troops were deployed. Minefields were laid. Patrol numbers were increased. Lighting around the facility was strengthened. Additionally, a major raid was conducted in the town of Ryukon. 200 armed Gestapo agents searched the town. 21 Norwegians were arrested and interrogated. The Germans were looking for other agents in the area. The Grouse team hiding on the Hardangervidda narrowly escaped these raids. They retreated deeper into the mountains. They hid for months, fighting hunger and cold. They survived by eating moss and lichen. Just before Christmas, Poulsen managed to hunt a reindeer. This enabled the team to survive. The Grouse team maintained radio contact with London. They reported that Operation Freshman had failed, and they awaited new orders. In Britain, the fate of Operation Freshman remained uncertain for days. The only aircraft to return to RAF Skitten was Halifax A, and its crew didn't know where the glider had fallen. On December 11, British intelligence intercepted a German communication. The message stated, 2 gliders and 1 aircraft shot down. The crew engaged in combat and was destroyed to the last man. This message was only part of the truth. The Germans were hiding the fact that most of the soldiers had been executed after capture, not killed in battle. But for the British, the message was clear. None of the 41 men had survived. 34 Royal Engineers, 7 Halifax crew members, all dead. One SOE official would later write, "Operation Freshman was one of the greatest disasters in our history, but the courage and sacrifice of these men must never be forgotten." The letters sent to families were brief and cold. "Your son/husband has been lost on a special mission." No further details. Security still applied. Families would not know how their loved ones died for years. Operation Freshman failed. 41 brave men lost their lives. Vemork continued to stand. The Germans continued producing heavy water. But the story didn't end here. The British did not give up their determination to destroy Vemork. They learned from their failure. They saw how risky glider operations were over such long distances. They understood the unreliability of the Rebecca-Eureka radar system. This system was later improved, and the Mk2 version achieved a 95% success rate during Operation Market Garden in 1944. More importantly, the strategy changed. Instead of a large British unit, a small Norwegian commando team would be sent. Men who knew the region, were accustomed to the climate, and skilled on skis. The Grouse team was still there, waiting. And in February 1943, Operation Gunnerside would begin. 6 more Norwegian commandos would parachute onto the Hardangervidda. They would join up with the Grouse team, and together they would carry out the most successful sabotage operation of World War II. But that's another story, and before I tell that story, we must return one last time to the heroes of Operation Freshman. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The British 1st Airborne Division arrived in Norway. One of their first tasks was to investigate the fate of Operation Freshman's victims. The Norwegian government and local people helped. The secret graves were found. The bodies were exhumed and identified. The remains of the 14 soldiers executed at Sletaba were recovered from the sand dunes at Brusand. The Norwegian farmer, as he had promised, showed them the location. The bodies were transferred to the Commonwealth War Graves section at Stavanger-Eiganes Church Cemetery. They were buried with full military honors. The remains of the 5 soldiers in Trandum Forest were also found. They were transferred to the Commonwealth War Graves section at Oslo Western Civil Cemetery. The crash victims from Fylkesdalen were honored in the same way. They were buried at Helleland Church Cemetery and Stavanger Eigenes Cemetery. And then the time for reckoning came. In December 1945, a war crimes tribunal was established in Oslo. 3 Germans sat in the dock. First was SS Dr. Werner Fritz Seeling. He was charged with torturing and killing 4 wounded British soldiers. Second was Gestapo driver and clerk Erich Hoffmann. He was charged with aiding and abetting the murders. Third was SS clerk Fritz Feuerlein. He was charged with shooting one of the soldiers in the back. The court heard testimonies. Surviving Norwegians described what they had seen. Medical reports were examined. Evidence was evaluated. The verdict was clear. Seeling was sentenced to death. On January 10, 1946, he was shot by firing squad at Akershus Fortress in Oslo. Hoffmann was sentenced to death. On May 15, 1946, he was hanged in Hamelin, Germany. The executioner was the famous British hangman Albert Pierpoint. Feuerlein was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was later extradited to the Soviet Union, as he had also committed crimes against Soviet prisoners of war. What about the other Germans who ordered and carried out the executions at Sledaba? Most had either died during the war or disappeared. The Oslo Gestapo chief had committed suicide a few days before the arrival of the 1st Airborne Division. General Nicholas von Falkenhorst, commander of all German forces in Norway, was tried in a separate court. He was charged with implementing the Commando Order and being responsible for the deaths of Operation Freshman's victims. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to 20 years in prison. He was released in 1953 due to health problems. What do you think of this story? Share with us in the comments. Part 2 ends here. In the third and final part, I will examine the broader historical context of this tragic operation. I will explain how the failure of Operation Freshman paved the way to the success of Operation Gunnerside. And you will see how the legacy of these 41 heroes lives on today. These men gave their lives to prevent Nazi Germany from building an atomic bomb. They failed, but their courage inspired those who came after them. And in the end, Vemork was destroyed. Their story is not just a war tragedy. It is proof of how brave ordinary people can be under extraordinary circumstances. For these stories of heroism and these brave men, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Now we move on to the final part. Welcome back to the final part. We continue without slowing down. 41 young men lost their lives in Norway's icy mountains. Operation Freshman ended in failure. Vemork still stood. Hitler's atomic bomb dream was still alive. But this story doesn't end here, because the deaths of these 41 heroes were not in vain. Their sacrifice opened the door to one of history's most daring sabotage operations, and in the end, the Nazi atomic bomb dream was shattered. If you've been watching this series from the beginning, we're now reaching the most powerful part of the story. And if you've just joined us, I highly recommend watching the previous parts. After the disaster of Operation Freshman, the Grouse team retreated deep into the Hardangervidda. 4 Norwegian agents, Jens Anton Poulsen, Knut Hogland, Klaus Hellberg, and Arne Schellstrup, had to survive in one of the world's harshest climates while hiding from the Germans. The situation was hopeless. The failure of Freshman didn't just mean the death of 41 men. The Germans now knew the target was Vemork. Security in the area had tripled. The Gestapo was combing the Hardangervidda. December 1942. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. The Grouse team's food supplies had run out. They were trying to survive 4 months on 2 weeks' worth of rations. They spent their days eating moss and lichen. Even a field mouse was considered a feast. Starvation was slowly killing them. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, team leader Jens Anton Poulsen went hunting alone. In the freezing wind, through knee-deep snow, he skied for hours. Finally, he saw dark shapes moving in the distance, a herd of reindeer. Poulsen had explored every corner of this plateau for years. He knew the direction of the wind, the behavior of the reindeer. He approached silently. He had one bullet. There would be no second chance. He took aim. He fired. The reindeer collapsed to the ground. That single reindeer saved the lives of 4 men. They celebrated Christmas eating meat. For the first time in weeks, their stomachs were full, and most importantly, their hope was renewed. This was a stroke of incredible luck. The grouse team maintained radio contact with London. Every day they sent and received encrypted messages, and at the end of January 1943, the news they had been waiting for arrived. SOE was planning a new operation. Lessons had been learned from freshmen. This time, no gliders. This time, no large British unit, just 6 Norwegian commandos, with their skis, their explosives, and their courage. The operation's code name, Gunnerside, named after a village in England, the place where SOE chief Charles Hambro went woodcock hunting with his family. 23-year-old Joachim Ronneberg was chosen as leader, tall, cool-headed, with steel-like determination in his eyes. His team included Frederick Kaiser, Casper Idland, Hans Storhag, Birger Stromsheim, and Knut Haukelid. All had received special training in Scotland's Cairngorm Mountains. On the night of February 16, 1943, they parachuted onto the Hardangervidda from a Halifax bomber. Bad weather dropped them kilometers off target. Some of their equipment was buried in the snow. They skied for days searching for the grouse team. Storms stopped them. Visibility dropped to 0, but they didn't give up. And finally, the 2 teams united. Now they were 10 men to destroy one of the world's most heavily guarded facilities. A very difficult mission awaited these 10 men, but they believed in themselves to the end. Vemork was built into the side of a deep valley. On one side were 200-meter vertical cliffs, on the other the frozen waters of the Mana River. The only entrance was a heavily guarded suspension bridge. Guards were posted on the bridge around the clock. Minefields had been laid. German soldiers were everywhere. The commandos studied the plan. Crossing the bridge would be suicide, but there was another way, a way that seemed impossible. Descend to the bottom of the valley, cross the frozen river, and climb the cliffs on the other side. The Germans hadn't accounted for this route because it seemed impossible. The Norwegians would show them that this route was possible. On the night of February 27th at 8 p.m., the operation began. 10 men, dressed in white camouflage, disappeared into the darkness. British uniforms were hidden beneath their snow gear. If they were captured, they would appear as British soldiers, not Norwegian civilians. This way, the local population would be protected from retaliation. They descended the valley slope. They crossed the frozen Mana River. The ice cracked, their feet sunk into the water, but they didn't stop. They began climbing the opposite cliffs.
It took 2 hours. Their fingertips were freezing, their muscles burned, but they climbed. And finally, they reached the area right next to the facility. At 11:30 p.m., they waited for the guard change. As the Germans rotated their guards, the commandos moved. They had chosen the perfect timing. Ronneberg and Frederick Kaiser infiltrated the facility through a cable tunnel. Kaiser squeezed through between the cables. Ronneberg followed. They reached the basement of the heavy water production room. Inside, there was a single Norwegian worker. He was on the night shift. He froze when he saw the commandos, but he didn't resist. Perhaps he secretly helped them. Ronneberg placed explosives on 18 heavy water cells. He used short fuses they would need to escape quickly. Everything was ready. They lit the fuses and they ran. At 1:24 a.m., a muffled explosion echoed through the valley. 500 kilograms of pure heavy water flowed into the sewers. The production cells were shattered. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single life was lost. 10 men went in, did their job, and vanished into the darkness. They had executed the plan brilliantly. After the explosion, the Germans went on alert, but it was too late. The commandos had already disappeared. 5 of them skied toward the Swedish border. 400 kilometers, 2 weeks. They reached Sweden. From there, they returned to England. The other 5 stayed in Norway. They joined the resistance movement. They fought the Germans until the end of the war. SOE later evaluated Operation Gunnerside. The conclusion? The most successful sabotage operation of World War II. But the story of Vemork wasn't over. The Germans repaired the facility. Production resumed. In November 1943, American B-17 bombers bombed Vemork. 22 civilians lost their lives. The facility was damaged, but not destroyed. Finally, in February 1944, the Germans gave up. They decided to ship the remaining heavy water to Germany, but Knut Haukelid was still in Norway, and he planned one more operation. The heavy water would be transported by a ferry crossing Lake Tinn. Haukelid placed a bomb under the ferry. On February 20, 1944, the ferry sank in the middle of the lake. The heavy water was buried 400 meters deep. The Nazi atomic bomb program had definitively come to an end. Victory was achieved. Operation Gunnerside was successful, but this success was built on the failure of Operation Freshman. The 41 men who died in Freshman had paved the way for Gunnerside. Their sacrifice had taught the British valuable lessons. The risks of long-distance glider operations were understood. The unreliability of the Rebecca-Eureka radar system was recognized. The advantages of small, local commando teams were grasped. More importantly, the Grouse team was still there. Despite the disaster of Freshman, 4 Norwegian agents had remained on the Hardanger Vidda. They had resisted starvation, cold, and Gestapo raids. Without them, Gunnerside would have been impossible. The heroes of Operation Freshman had unknowingly changed the course of history. What do you think about this heroism? In 1945, the British 1st Airborne Division arrived in Norway. They found the Freshman victims. They opened the graves that the Norwegian people had secretly protected for years. They buried them with military honors. Today, these heroes rest in 3 cemeteries: Oslo, Stavanger, and Helleland. Memorial ceremonies are held every November. In 2022, on the 80th anniversary of the operation, 67 family members visited Norway. They saw the places where their grandfathers and fathers had spent their final moments. They stood at crash sites, execution grounds, and cemeteries, and the Norwegian people embraced them, because this nation had never forgotten those soldiers. These 41 men accepted one of history's most dangerous missions. They volunteered without knowing where they were going. When captured, they didn't give up their secrets under torture. They remained soldiers until their last breath. This is not failure. This is heroism. And their courage was not in vain. Vemork was destroyed. Hitler never obtained the atomic bomb. We've reached the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching this video. Operation Freshman is one of the least known but most important stories of World War II. These men died for us, for our freedom, and it is our duty to remember them. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments. In my next video, I'll tell another forgotten story of heroism. If you're curious about which story it will be, don't forget to subscribe. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye. See you soon.